If you cannot win the game, change the rules. Israel's strategic paradigm shift for the Middle East. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. I am Lydia Morgan, JIJ's Chief Operations Officer, and I am very happy to be with you here today live from Jerusalem. Before we start today's session, I want to tell you shortly about the Jerusalem Institute of Justice. JIJ is a leading legal research institute that strives to uphold human rights all across the Middle East and is committed to safeguarding the legitimate standing of the State of Israel among the nations. It is our mission to fight the rise of anti-Semitism all around the world and the constant attempts to delegitimize the nation of Israel. For those who are joining us today for the first time, I invite you to watch our previous lectures, which are all available on JIJ's YouTube channel. Our session today is dedicated to a discussion regarding Israel's new strategy towards peace in the Middle East and the shift Israel has made in the Middle East paradigm that has prevailed for the last few decades. A major milestone in this shift was the signing of the Abrahamic Accords on September 15, 2020, and the following peace agreements with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. This was succeeded by an important peace agreement with Sudan and renewed relations with Morocco. The Abrahamic Accords have a huge impact on Israeli diplomacy. We have chosen 4 points of particular importance to focus on today. We will start with clarifying the formation of the long-existing Middle Eastern peace paradigm. We will then examine the objectives and motives that stand behind the Abrahamic Accords. Then we will take a closer look at what is included in the Accords and what is absent from it. We will then finalize our session today with a discussion regarding the effects and ramifications arising from the Accords. So we're going to jump right in. How did the long-standing working plan toward peace come to be? The theory was that if Israel wishes to establish diplomatic relations or promote full peace with the Arab world, it must first reach a permanent agreement with the Palestinians. As we just mentioned, this diplomatic paradigm has dominated the Middle East for several decades. Let's look at how this concept has evolved over the years. Since the founding of the State of Israel, the Arab world has refused to grant it any form of recognition. On the 27th of November, 1947, the United Nations voted on the partition plan, which proposed the division of British-mandated Palestine into 2 independent states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs. Following the Arab League's demand for Palestine's independence and establishment as the one and only state, all the Arab countries voted against the partition plan. And following Israel's declaration of independence on the 8th of May, 1948, a military coalition of 7 Arab nations invaded the newly born Israeli state with the plan of obliterating it and establishing an Arab state on all of the land. They failed categorically. As a result of the war, the State of Israel controlled the areas that the UN had recommended for the proposed Jewish state, as well as a large part of the area originally intended for the Arab state. The Arab nations refused to sign peace treaties with Israel to end the war and instead signed armistice agreements. 19 years passed, and on June 5th, 1967, the Six-Day War broke out, during which Israel fought 3 armies, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, which were assisted by Iraq, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Lebanon, Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. I am happy to say the war ended with another astonishing Israeli military victory, one of the most impressive achievements in modern military history. During the war, Israel occupied significant territories in Judea and Samaria, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. The outcomes and ramifications of the Six-Day War continue to have a lasting impact on the state of Israel and are the basis of many disputes between Israel and the Palestinians. In response to Israel's attempts to broker peace after the Six-Day War, in August 1967, 8 Arab states gathered in the city of Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, at what has been named the Khartoum Conference. The heads of the Arab states agreed to unite their political efforts and issued a statement which was dubbed the 3 No's. No to peace with Israel, no to recognition of Israel, and no to negotiations with Israel. The message for Israel was unequivocal. You have no partner with which to negotiate peace. Since 1967, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, has represented the Palestinian side of the Arab-Israeli conflict and has vetoed any attempts at peace. However, Israel did succeed on the basis of common interests to establish peace agreements with 2 moderate Sunni states, one with Egypt and one with Jordan. Let's take a closer look at these relationships. The peace agreement between Israel and Egypt was signed in 1979 on the White House lawn by Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and US President Jimmy Carter. Israel-Egypt relations are characterized as a cold peace. The long-standing hostility and 5 bloody wars certainly do not help. These relations never enjoyed extensive support among the general Egyptian public, and the Egyptians opposed full normalization with Israel. In fact, these relations focused solely on economic, security, and limited military cooperation as part of the war on terror in Sinai. 2 years into the agreement, following the assassination of Egypt's President Anwar Sadat in October 1981, Israeli-Egyptian relations began to deteriorate. The Muslim cleric who approved and authorized the murder of Anwar Sadat was none other than Omar Abd al-Rahman, who was later convicted in the United States for his part in the attack on the Twin Towers in 1993. The assassination of Anwar Sadat was an expression of the dissatisfaction of the Egyptians and indeed the entire world. The entire Arab world. Further deterioration was recorded in the wake of the Egyptian Revolution and the removal of President Hosni Mubarak, which were part of the Arab Spring in 2011. In September 2011, thousands of Egyptians attacked the Israeli embassy in Egypt. The Israeli ambassador and 85 other Israeli diplomats and their family members were flown out of Egypt, preventing a major disaster. Relations between Israel and Egypt began to improve in 2014. Former Israeli ambassador to Egypt, Chaim Koren, said that under the presidency of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who was elected in 2014, relations between Israel and Egypt are without a doubt the best relations we have had since the peace agreement was signed. He further defined the relations between the two countries as intimate. Egypt, according to Quran, recognizes the common interests it shares with Israel, including the desire to fight the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a terror organization. Israel has benefited greatly from our peace agreement with Egypt. Today, our countries share common threats: the Iranians and the dangers of ISIS and Hamas. Israel's peace agreement with Jordan was signed in 1994 between Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and the King of Jordan, Hussein bin Talal. President Clinton pressured Hussein to join the initiative and promised to write off Jordan's debts to the United States. President Clinton signed the agreement as a witness. At the ceremony, Hussein bin Talal delivered a moving speech and set high expectations. Israel and Jordan have established diplomatic relations and full normalization, including the opening of embassies and the establishment of a free trade agreement. Despite all the potential and the genuine desire of the parties for warm relations, they have failed to establish such a fruitful relationship. Hussein's son, King Abdullah, said in an interview in 2010 that the relations between the two countries had reached a low. Since that interview, there has been a further deterioration in Israeli-Jordanian relations. And in October 2018, the Kingdom of Jordan decided not to allow Israel to lease Jordan Valley territories from it any longer. Israeli-Jordanian relations took two other hits only a few weeks ago, when the Jordanians refused to allow Netanyahu's plane to fly to the Emirates using Jordan's airspace, and when Jordanian Prince Hussein bin Abdullah canceled his visit to the Temple Mount. Aside from the two agreements with these countries, Israel has maintained informal relations with numerous Arab states over the years. Israel-Iran relations, which have known many ups and downs, are a good example. Iran was even among the few countries in the early 1950s that recognized the state of Israel. Israel and Iran maintained rich and prosperous trade relations until Iran became a major threat to Israel. The turning point in their relationship can be connected to the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the rise to power of the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and the development of the Iranian axis of resistance. In the 42 years that have passed since the peace agreement with Egypt, and the more than 25 years since the signing of the agreement with Jordan, little progress with other Arab nations was made. Until 2020, when Israel, in an historic step, signed a peace agreement with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. The new agreements represent a breakthrough for three main reasons. One, because they are not based on fear, at least not on fear of each other. Two, because they set a new paradigm according to which normalization with Israel is good for both sides and does not only benefit Israel. And three, because it is now abundantly clear to the Palestinians that the creation of peace with Israel no longer depends on them. Now that we have a basic understanding of the former Israeli-Arab peace paradigm and the importance of challenging it, we will take a closer look at the motives that brought about the signing of the new peace agreement between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States. Israel has a long list of interests, including restraining Iran, changing Israel's position in the Middle East, circumventing the Palestinian veto on peace, and strengthening Israel's international standing. All of these goals are complementary to the interests of promoting security, economy, tourism, and advancing civic cooperation. Like the UAE, Israel is also interested in reducing the power and influence of two prominent groups in the Middle East: the radical Shiite alliance led by Iran and the Turkey-Qatar axis. In the Palestinian context, Israel is working to promote a new formula of peace for peace. If Israel can achieve peace with many Arab states before reaching a permanent agreement with the Palestinians, Israel will then arrive at the negotiation table in a powerful position, free of threats of violence. Apart from security and political interests, Israel also recognized the economic potential inherent in establishing relations with the United Arab Emirates. Israel is prepared to allocate many resources to cultivating the relationship and expanding the circles of mutual investment. Many Israelis who speak Arabic and who are familiar with the local mentality enjoy the advantages in expanding their business enterprises with the Emirates. Moreover, Israel believes that an Israeli foothold in the Gulf will be a gateway for advancement with other Arab countries with whom we don't yet have formal relations. Let's move on and talk about the motives of the United States for promoting the Abrahamic Accords. For former US President Trump and his administration, who led the agreement and became its architects, it was very important to produce an agreement of peace in the region. Aside from being an impressive political achievement, the US was interested in strengthening the relationship with its key allies in the Middle East against Iran. As for the motives of the United Arab Emirates, first and foremost, they were interested in strengthening their position in the Middle East. The UAE, along with Saudi Arabia, form the moderate pro-Western Sunni coalition, which is one of the three main alliances operating in the Middle East. The other two, as we mentioned previously, are the radical Shiite axis led by Iran and the Sunni Islamist bloc of Turkey, Qatar, and Western Libya. The peace agreement with Israel helps the United Arab Emirates establish regional stability. They understand very well that Israel shares the motivation of weakening Iran, and they prefer to have Israel with its military capabilities on their side. Strengthening ties with Israel also allows them to distance Qatar from the Gaza Strip and to deter Turkey's President Erdogan in his aspirations and pursuit of power. Regarding the Palestinian reaction to the agreement, the United Arab Emirates understood that it must minimize the fallout, and therefore it stipulated as a condition the non-application of Israeli sovereignty over the territories of Judea and Samaria. The UAE recognizes the economic value of peace with Israel. The United Arab Emirates sees Israel as a leading international power with great potential for cooperation in a wide range of fields, such as trade, technology, and tourism, to name but a few. The United Arab Emirates itself is a leading and growing economic power, with the second most powerful economy in the Middle East behind Saudi Arabia. The United Arab Emirates, whose economy has relied on oil reserves for years, has begun to develop additional revenue streams, including industries such as tourism, retail, and financials. In order to accomplish their goals, they need to attract foreign investors and investments, and therefore are promoting measures to make it easier for foreign investors to operate in the kingdom. A zero corporation tax is one of those incentives. The Abrahamic Accords. Let's look at what is included in them and what is not. On September 15th, 2020, on the lawn of the White House, former US President Donald Trump, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Foreign Minister of the United Arab Emirates Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed, and Bahraini Foreign Minister Abdullah bin Khalifa signed the Abrahamic Accords and made history. The agreement includes an introduction, 12 articles, and an appendix. The intention of all parties to establish full, warm, and mutually beneficial relations was made clear when all sides expressed their desire to establish peace, diplomatic cooperation, and full normalization of ties between them and their peoples. So very different from Israel's previous peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan. Let's take a look at the main points from the Accords. Article 3 of the agreement talks of the diplomatic side of the relationship and states the establishment of embassies and the exchanging of ambassadors. In its Article 4, the agreement speaks of the cooperation and coordination between the parties regarding peace and stability, and consider it a fundamental pillar to build upon. Article 5 determines that the parties shall complete bilateral agreements in 15 various fields, such as finance and investment, civil aviation, innovation, trade, healthcare, science and technology, and tourism. In Article 7, the parties commit to work with each other and with the United States in order to advance the causes of peace, stability, and prosperity. Articles 10 through 12 are procedural and include rules for resolving disputes and notification of the registration of the agreement at the UN. Now, let's see what seems to be missing from the Accords. 3 main issues were not included in the agreement. First, the deferment of the application of Israeli law to some of the territories of Judea and Samaria. Second, there is no mention of the two-state solution to the Palestinian-Israeli issue. And the third notable item missing is any reference to the United States agreement with the United Arab Emirates for the supply of advanced offensive weapons systems. We want to move on and talk a little bit about the effects and ramifications arising from the Abraham Accords. It dramatically changes the balance of power in the Middle East and represents a new geopolitical era. True, not enough time has passed to define Israel's new relations as a success. And yet, there are substantial reasons to believe that Israel's new course of action in its foreign relations will indeed be successful for these 4 reasons. Israel's success in changing the peace paradigm and the message successfully sent to the Palestinians that they no longer hold the key to Israel's peace with the Arab world. Second, the high satisfaction among the general public interested in promoting a wide range of cooperations with the United Arab Emirates. Third, it indicates the establishment of a united front against the Iranian axis. And fourth, the agreement has already demonstrated its ability to open additional channels of dialogue and the removal of the longstanding barrier of normalizing relations with the Arab world. Another milestone and a good example that the barrier has indeed been lifted was the announcement of normalizations of relations with Sudan on October 23rd, 2020. Unlike the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, which were never in real conflict with Israel, Sudan actually fought against Israel in the 1948 Israeli War of Independence and the Six-Day War of 1967. Peace with Sudan is also symbolic because it was at the summit of the Arab League in Khartoum, Sudan, shortly after the Six-Day War, that the Arab states agreed on the 3 no's, as we mentioned earlier. The latest development in this new era is the US-mediated peace agreement between Israel and Morocco that was made possible after the US announced that it recognizes Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara. These renewed relations are also an attempt to gather regional support for the US Israel-backed opposition to the Iranian regime's policies. The Palestinians' international status has been damaged, and they seem to have lost their last anchor that kept them relevant. They have received a severe blow and have yet to prove their ability to recover. Let's take a look at the different reactions of the Palestinians and the Arab League to the peace agreements. The Palestinian Authority announced on August 18, 2020, that they consider the peace agreement a stab in the back and that they completely reject it. Shortly afterwards, the Palestinians recalled their ambassadors from the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Notably, the Arab League, from the other point of view, has refused to make a declaration condemning the peace agreements as they were requested to by the Palestinians at the summit of the Arab League on September 9th, 2020. The Palestinians now understand that the Arab world accepts the idea of normalizing relations with Israel. To illustrate the intensity of the impact and to grasp the change in Palestinian rhetoric, let's take a look at what 2 of Mahmoud Abbas's closest advisors had to say after the signing of the Abrahamic Accords. In an article published just a few weeks ago, they called on Abbas to adopt a new objective. Instead of pushing for a full-fledged Palestinian state, they urged him to strive for a soft sovereignty, in which Jordan and Egypt will be involved in West Bank and Gaza Strip agreements. It is interesting to see that the Palestinians changed their tone after the signing of the agreement between Israel and Morocco, as they did not release a statement of condemnation as they had in previous cases. We have come to the end of our time together this afternoon, and there are 3 important things we want you to remember from today. First, Israel, together with the moderate Arab states, is creating a coalition bloc against common threats in the Middle East. Second, Israel successfully broke the Palestinian veto and set a new paradigm for peace in the Middle East, which determines that Israel's path for peace with the Arab world doesn't have to go through the Palestinians. And third, Israel is becoming a regional rising power in the changing Middle East. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to share with you. Please email us your questions and stay tuned for updates on future lectures. Shalom from Jerusalem. Bye-bye.